Are diversity trainings actually effective? That is the topic of today's episode of Shia Sophia. Welcome back. I'm back from vacation. I'm Adrian, your climate scientist, crafter, amateur philosopher host. It is wonderful to be back with you after my brief bit of time off on vacation, taking care of things with family. Anyway, I part of the things I want to do with this channel is not just get into sort of the theoretical thing of about science or what science does or what science isn't, but to actually talk about questions that are of interest that science is looking at and end up at times in the news also talk about some of that. And one of them hot topics here, at least in some of the local news, actually is about diversity trainings right now. So I figured walk through some of the interesting research. In particular, this article is a little older from Real Clear Science. This was actually published in December of 2020, but I think it's actually a very good overview of the literature on the topic because, of course, we're doing a lot of diversity trainings now, whether it be in academia or in corporate or in federal government or in state government. There's a lot of them going on around here now. Particularly after the events of last year with the death of George Floyd, there was a dramatic increase in the number. So it's a fair question scientists are asking now is, are these trainings actually effective at what they claim to be promoting? Diversity in whatever fields or any number of different things. And this is an excellent article. And at the same time, when we get into this, I'm actually going to talk about some of the method issues that come up in science, because one of the important things about answering a question when you're posing a hypothesis is the method and the experiment you construct to answer the question. And this gentleman, Musa Al-Gharbi, who wrote this article for Real Clear Science and did an excellent summary of the literature. I will link this in the description for you because I highly recommend it. It's a great article to read. He points out some very interesting things, and he's very much in the research. Let me go to his page real quick so you can see him. So Musa here is a PhD student. This is public, so I'm not sharing anything crazy. This is public. He is a PhD student and a fellow for multiple things here at Columbia University. So this is very much his field of study and interest that he gets into, talking about these kinds of things. So he's absolutely a perfect person to help guide us through this kind of conversation here and doing all of his work at Columbia University currently. So I want to walk through this article a little bit and hit on the main points. And one thing I will say is Mr. Al-Gharbi, I should say, I apologize, put in a heck of a lot of peer-reviewed articles on this topic when he wrote this particular article. And I'm not going to say it's all of it, so please, I'm going to caveat it right away. If you know of other studies or other write-ups like this, please share them with me. I'd be very curious to read them. Be happy to read them. I generally found this one to be one of the best summaries that I could find on the subject. But I would be interested to hear more and to see more from others who provide it. So let us get in here. So he's written a few times for Real Clear Science. He's got his thing here on that. So he makes a good point straight out of the gate. So in the wake of George Floyd's killing and the protests that followed, many colleges and universities have been rolling out new training requirements, often oriented toward reducing biases and encouraging people from high status groups to check their privilege. The explicit goal of these training programs is generally to help create a more positive and welcoming institutional environment for people from historically marginalized and underrepresented groups. As I explained elsewhere, there is a long literature on the benefits of diversity on knowledge production, and this is true. There is a lot of literature that says diversity in the workplace is a good thing with respect to knowledge production, and we want diversity in the sciences. We want people from various backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses. Which reminds me, there's a great article in Aereo. I will link that here too. That you should read today that talks about diversity in STEM. Fascinating article to read. I agree that's an excellent article to read. Not the topic here, but I will link it. So here's the thing is, there's a really long literature, but the approaches, what he goes on to say is, however, many of the approaches to training people on how to navigate and utilize diversity were implemented by corporations, nonprofits, and universities before their effectiveness had been rigorously tested, if at all. Again, this is a thing, we love to implement things, but but we don't know why there. And I apologize for the weird ad. I'm using a VPN right now, so I'm getting ads from weird things. So I'm going to get an ad blocker here at some point soon. Although the precursor to contemporary diversity training, sensitivity training, dates back to the mid-1940s, diversity training became especially important beginning in the mid-1980s and early 90s. Why? Starting in the late 70s through early 80s, universities began enrolling significantly higher numbers of women, minorities, and people from middle-class and lower-income backgrounds. Soon thereafter, employers found themselves with a much more heterogeneous labor pool. This is true. This is an evolution with history. The same is true following the Civil Rights Act, too, that a lot more minorities started to enroll in college. So a genuinely legitimate thing to consider. We need to be sensitive to some of the diverse backgrounds that there are. Absolutely. They had to face, often for the first time, some of the challenges that come along with the benefits of diversity, as people with increasingly divergent backgrounds and perspectives were put side by side and tasked with common goals. And so one of the things, so Carla Borisenko has talked about this on her channel a couple of times, that one of the things from an organizational psychology perspective is that people have different work styles, different backgrounds, different work styles, and so that's part of it with respect to the diversity challenge here, is that you putting all these divergent backgrounds and perspectives next to each other, they probably have different styles of working. And so navigating conflict in the workplace does have a little bit to do with how do you manage different work styles, not just the other sensitive issues that arise with diversity, with race or gender or sex or any number of other things. Beginning in the mid-90s, however, it became increasingly clear that due to their lack of validation, many widely used interventions could be ineffective or harmful, and empirical literature was built up measuring the effectiveness of diversity-related training programs. The picture that has emerged is not very flattering. See, that's where we get into something interesting. So it's clearly he's not quite a doctor yet. He's still a PhD student. My apologies. But Mr. Al Garby's discussion here is about, is going to point this out, actually. And he, like I said, he comes loaded with receipts here, and I approve of this wholeheartedly, to write an article like this, and he does a very good job orienting it, as we'll see. He's got a lot of sections where he's main bullet point commentary on the topic, backed up with references galore, and most of them peer-reviewed, published papers in psychology and sociology and administration, things like this. So this is a great article to go back through and read yourself. There's going to be a few things that I want to highlight, and then we'll go from there. So the limited research suggesting diversity-related training programs as efficacious was based on things like surveys before and after the training, or testing knowledge or attitudes about various groups or policies. And to be clear, the training does help people answer survey questions in the way the training said they should, and many people who undergo the training say they enjoyed it or found it helpful in post-training questionnaires. However, when scientists set about to investigate whether the programs actually changed behaviors, i.e., do they reduce expressions of bias? Do they reduce discrimination? Do they foster greater collaboration across groups? Do they help with retaining employees from historically marginalized or underrepresented groups? Do they increase productivity or reduce conflicts in the workplace? For all these behavioral metrics, the metrics that actually matter, not only is the training ineffective, it is often counterproductive. This is actually, he makes an excellent point with these two paragraphs, and it is about method. And this is a challenge with scientific research and writing. In any peer-reviewed study, this is one of the things that I look at when I do peer review on studies, is what was the method? Relative to the question you were answering, what was the method? And does it actually would it actually give you the answer to your question and prove or disprove your, support or not support your hypothesis, to be proper in the statistical language? So basically saying, is your hypothesis correct or is it not? And he actually makes a very good point here. There are a lot of studies, as he says, not necessarily a lot, but again, I'm going to say I'm taking this somewhat limited. So if you have extra research you want to add to this topic, shoot it my way. I'd be curious to read it myself. And And I always encourage you to go read things for yourself. So again, I'm going to list this below, so I encourage you to go read this. It's a fascinating article here in Real Clear Science, and I'm glad this guy, this student, summarized it here. There's a bug on my screen. Fascinating. You can't see it, but there's a bug on my screen. This will be entertaining. Part of the blooper reel. Anyway. So the thing is, if the method is designed in such a way that it doesn't actually answer the question or show that it was effective, that's the problem that he's getting at here. His point with the first paragraph is to say that just getting surveys before and after, or testing knowledge or attitudes about groups or policies within an organization, yeah, sure, you can get positive answers to that after diversity training. And yeah, oftentimes people do think it was helpful in the post-training questionnaire, but thinking something was helpful doesn't necessarily translate to real-world behaviors after the training, which is what he's getting at here. And that's a method problem with some of these studies that show diversity-related trainings are effective. And that's what he's getting at. And I for one agree with him, is if because I think we've had this happen in other studies where we're talking about knowledge with respect to climate change. If you put somebody through a training and quiz them right after it, yeah, they're probably going to get it right. Are they going to remember it later? Is it going to change how they work with the data later? Things like that are a concern with some of the climate change literature and climate change communication too. So asking about behaviors and assessing behaviors at organizations that do diversity trainings is an excellent way to get at whether a diversity training actually did anything or if it was utterly pointless. And in Al Garby's view, with the literature to back it up, he does think it was pointless, as we're going to find out. And that's an interesting thing here. So, because there's a huge number of diversity trainings being done. So I'm going to go through some of this from here, but I encourage you to go read the whole article. I just want to point out some interesting extra features here. So, because he breaks it down like this. He's got main points for each one and then a huge amount of references after. So, training is generally ineffective at its stated goals. And they have different goals, he points out here, from helping to increase hiring and retention of people from historically marginalized and underrepresented groups, to eliminating prejudicial attitudes and behaviors, to members of said groups, to reducing conflict and enhancing cooperation and belonging among employees. Problem is, they tend to be really, really ineffective. That's the problem, is what, generally speaking, just on a sort of general average level, they don't tend to increase diversity. They don't tend to increase the retention rate for historically marginalized groups. They don't tend to reduce harassment or discrimination, and they don't tend to have improved productivity and cooperation, cohesion in there. So the problem, he also points this out, which I would love to see more discussion of this, is, if people are tasked with ensuring the compliance with these programs and they're recognizing them as ineffective, then that's an issue, because you're basically being paid to do nothing, to me. But that's a whole separate question to me as to whether or not what's going on with that in terms of who's running a diversity training. But this is an interesting thing that he's pointing out, that apparently a slew of studies, at least the bunch here that he's got, show that said trainings aren't effective. Said diversity trainings aren't effective at meeting their stated goals. That's an immediate problem straight out of the gate, according to science. Again, well, no, I'm being bad. The studies suggest, because science itself never suggests anything, the studies done as part of the scientific process suggest. Anyway, training often reinforces biases. Okay, often when people attempt to do fact checks, they begin by underscoring the falsehood and then try to debunk the falsehood. But this can create what psychologists call an illusory truth effect, where people end up remembering the falsehood and forgetting the correction, and then attributing their misinformation to the very source that had tried to correct it. So illusory truth is basically where you have the sort of, if you've seen something like myth and then actually it's this. What they're talking about here is you're putting the myth up first, and that's what people are remembering. And they're not remembering what you said about that myth that was wrong. So they're remembering the myth as being true instead of the actual thing that you were trying to tell them, that no, actually it's this. So this is a particularly aggravating problem, the illusory truth effect, and it goes back to communications issues a lot of times, as I've been seeing in some of the literature. But this is an interesting problem. So by articulating, a similar effect seems to hold with anti-bias training. By articulating various stereotypes and associated with particular groups, emphasizing the salience of those stereotypes, and then calling for their suppression, they often end up reinforcing them in participants' minds. Sometimes they even implant new stereotypes. And this is another problem. It's just like, so suppose somebody didn't know that there was this stereotype. Well, now you've introduced it to a person. You've made it possible that that person will go with that stereotype from there. Congratulations, diversity training. It's supposed to get rid of stereotypes and reduce biases and things. Backwards problem. Other times, they can fail to improve negative perceptions about the target group, yet increase negative views about others. For instance, an empirical investigation of white privilege training found that it did nothing to make participants more sympathetic to minorities. It just increased resentment toward lower-income whites. This study I do remember reading a couple of years ago myself, and I think it's actually it was 2019 this particular study came out. I do remember reading that one. That was a very well done study from what I saw. And yeah, they basically caused most people to be just more hostile toward lower income, poor white people if they happen to be white. But it did nothing to make people more sympathetic or want to work more with minorities. So congratulations, that white privilege training didn't help in the slightest. And all of these are linked off. He did a great job linking these all off. So if you want to go read them too, go for it. Go for it, critique it, have all sorts of fun. I would love to hear your commentary and thoughts on the different things. Be civil, please. Remember, I will enforce the rules and ban you from my channel ban you from the comments anyway. I think I can do that. I gotta check. I will not be responsive to you if you get uncivil, and I will start enforcing rules. Anyway. Encouraging people to ignore racial and cultural differences often results in diminished cooperation across racial lines. Meanwhile, multicultural training, emphasizing those differences, often ends up reinforcing race essentialism among participants. It is not clear what the best position between these poles is, such that negative side effects can be avoided, let alone how to consistently strike the balance in training. Yes, this is a particular issue here, because you don't want to just utterly say that there's no differences and not be respectful of different cultures that people grow up in, in different backgrounds that people come from, but at the same time, you don't want to overhype those differences either. So it's an incredible balancing act, and it doesn't seem that they've gotten that right with diversity trainings. So this is something he's pointing out with the swath of literature that he has here. Training can actually increase biased behavior and minority turnover. You wouldn't think it would do that, but counterintuitive things. And this is, having been forced into diversity training myself, at least the one that I took wasn't as bad as this. So I'm going to say it's not all diversity trainings do this. But I have seen it in a lot of materials that I've viewed online that have been made publicly available by others or grabbed and leaked, things like that, and end up being, well, not grabbed and leaked, but made available online. I'm sorry, they've been made publicly available. But the challenge here is that a lot of them do have this problem. Yeah, a lot of them do have this problem, and I apologize. I'm trying to figure out what sound issues too. I'm not sure if I'm still having issues, so please let me know. I think I have it figured out, not 100% sure. One unfortunate consequence of depicting these attitudes and behaviors as common is that it makes many feel more comfortable expressing biased attitudes or behaving in discriminatory ways. Insofar as it is depicted as ubiquitous, diversity-related training can actually normalize bias. Check that out right there. That's a problem. You got to be careful with that and make sure it's not, diversity training is not contributing to normalizing bias. For others, the very fact that the company has diversity-related training is proof that it is a non-biased institution. This perception often reduces concerns about bias and discrimination by oneself or others. As a consequence, people not only become more likely to act in more biased ways, but they also react with increased skepticism and hostility when colleagues claim to have been discriminated against. Yes, so we have diversity training, therefore we are good. We can't be biased and discriminatory. Here's the thing, doesn't help, because it's just like you're viewing the institution as pure, so people get hostile when there's actual discrimination that happens, which needs to be reported, and you need to make sure that it gets called out when it needs to be called out, and there's some things there. You should be expected to not discriminate against people in the workplace. End of sentence. There. In fact, there's a whole Title 6 and Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act, I believe. Somebody can fact check me on that. Title 6 and Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act expressly forbid discriminating based upon race, sex, and much of the like there in the workplace, whether in hiring or during workplace day-to-day activities. You cannot do it. Civil Rights Act expressly forbids that on the part of the employer. Anyway, good to know, right? Meanwhile, those who are discriminated against become more likely to rationalize mistreatment by others in the institution after undergoing diversity training. For the same reason, because they believe the institution must be fair in virtue of its commitment to diversity-related training. Indeed, minority employees are often called upon to lead diversity reviews themselves. Consequently, they become less likely to actually report or address wrongdoing. As a result, problems persist unabated, often leading to higher turnover or among the very groups the programs were ostensibly designed to render more comfortable. So in other words, you're inadvertently normalizing bias, allowing more bias to happen than you intended. Diversity training was intended to do the opposite, to get the bias out, or at least to make it known that those biases are not good things. And the opposite happens. According to a substantial body of science. Again, he is great in what he has here in terms of the number of peer-reviewed studies that show this, and quite a swath of literature. Often alienates people from high-status groups and reduces morale. This is particularly concerning to me when I think of things that are based particularly on critical race theory. Because critical race theory does have a tendency to make it very much an us against them kind of approach. It does tend to represent white people as being bad and everybody else as being good, or I should say, white people as being oppressed and all other non-white folks as being oppressed. Yes, no, I said that wrong. White people as oppressors in critical race theory, and non-white people as oppressed. So this is a problem when you're talking about it. And he talks about it here. Diversity-related training programs often depict people from historically marginalized and disenfranchised groups as important and worthwhile, celebrating their heritage and culture, while criticizing the dominant culture as fundamentally depraved. People from minority groups are discussed in overwhelmingly positive terms, while people from majority groups are characterized as typically and uniquely ignorant, insensitive, or outright malicious with respect to those who are different from them. Members of the majority group are told to listen to and validate the perspectives of people from historically marginalized or disadvantaged groups, even as they are instructed to submit their own feelings and perspectives to intense scrutiny. In short, there's a clear double standard in many of these programs with respect to how members of dominant groups, typically men, whites, and or homosexuals, are described as compared to minority groups, women, ethnic racial minorities, LGBTQ, and so on. The result is that many members from the dominant group walk away from the training believing that themselves, their culture, their perspectives, and interests are not valued at the institution, and certainly not as much of those minority team members, reducing their morale and productivity. Training also leads many to believe that they have to walk on eggshells when engaging with members of minority populations. By calling attention not just to clear examples of harm and prejudice, but just as much or more to things like implicit attitudes and microaggressions, participants come to view colleagues from historically marginalized and disenfranchised groups as fragile and easily offended. As a result, members of the dominant group become less likely to try and build relationships or collaborate with people from minority groups. This one is a good one to highlight, and particularly for those of you who have heard of critical race theory, a lot of critical race theory trainings that I've been able to view online. You can see this via the Actively Unwoke channel on YouTube, via New Discourses. Counterweight talks about all of this. There's a lot of different groups now that are talking about this. And I will say this is not true of all diversity programs. But this is particularly true of the historically ones, but also any of the ones based in critical race theory tend to do this, sometimes subtly and sometimes pretty overtly. So again, it's not hard to understand how people would be really, really angry at being treated very, very poorly, and all these different things. So of course it of course it alienates people and makes them less productive. So you're not treating everybody with compassion necessarily. And double standards, lots of double standards in here. So that is a concern. And it's a concern that I agree with. And he obviously, again, has studies to back it up, what he thinks here is true about these different things. So I will say the study of the trainings based specifically on critical race theory are a bit newer. So I don't know that they've been fully evaluated yet, but at least from what I see, because I know just looking at different news sites that I follow, that there's an awful lot of lawsuits pertaining to critical race theory based trainings and messaging from leadership in various organizations. If you followed the Coca-Cola thing not too long ago that Carlin Borisenko broke on her channel, that Coke was mandating their employees take a training that taught them to try to be less white, and assigned all these negative characteristics to white. You can find that over on Carlin's channel. I'm not going to link that here. I will link Carlin's channel in the description. I'll do her a favor on that front. But yeah, it's this is where trainings have a problem. Is this, like, if you are going out and doing a disservice like that, it's an issue. I will say, the training that I was forced to take at my employment didn't do this as much, which is, I think, a very good thing. I will give them credit for that. They didn't do this as much, or at least as much as I could tell. I'm going to go back and look at my notes on that eventually, but didn't do that as much as I could tell. So I will say it's not true of all training programs, and he says here often, but not all. Focus on implicit attitudes. This is a recent thing. I noticed there's a lot of focus on the implicit bias test and implicit association testing, but there's actually been a number of studies and things that have come out recently, and I think even the founders of Project Implicit last year, which is the famous thing out of Harvard, came out and said, our test really doesn't measure all that much, and in particular, it doesn't actually predict discriminatory behavior. That's the thing. It doesn't predict actual behaviors. And in a way, this kind of makes sense because, you're talking about, how do I put this? You're talking about implicit bias, and there's also norms in the workplace at the same time, or norms in different institutions that, you're not supposed to act on those impulses necessarily. So there's some restraint there, perhaps, that I could see. Speculating, no idea. Totally my opinion on that. Speculating. But that's the thing, is when they're talking about it, most interventions to attempts to change implicit attitudes are ineffective. Effects from implicit bias, when present, tend to be small and fleeting, is what he points to here with his research. Again, I would love to see more other stuff. Feel free to point it out to me. I would be curious to see it. But that's what we see here so far. Moreover, there is no evidence that changing implicit attitudes has any significant, let alone durable, impact on reducing biased or discriminatory behaviors. In short, the construct itself has numerous validity issues, and the training has no demonstrable benefit. Counterweight talks about this too, actually, in some of their work. I pointed out for you. Finally, microaggressions in here. Here's the thing. Contemporary diversity training often draws significant attention to microaggressions. So this is a very recent thing, microaggressions. In the literature anyway, I think microaggressions is pretty recent. Small, typically inadvertent faux pas involving people from historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups. Cumulative effects of microaggressions are held to have significant adverse impacts on the well-being of people from low status groups. However, although 1974, I apologize, it's older than I thought. Although the microaggressions framework goes back to 1974, there is virtually no systematic research detailing if and how microaggressions are harmful, for whom, and under what circumstances. Indeed, there is not even robust conceptual clarity in the literature as to what constitutes a microaggression. There is no systematic empirical evidence that training on microaggressions has any significant or long-term effects on behavior, nor that it correlates with any other positive institutional outcomes. In fact, when presented with canonical microaggressions, which are sort of like things that are classically considered microaggressions, if you will, Black and Hispanic respondents overwhelmingly find them to be inoffensive, and we have ample reason to believe that sensitizing people to perceive and take greater offense at these slights actually would cause harm. The evidence is clear and abundant that increased perceptions of racism have adverse mental and physical consequences for minorities. In short, not only is there no evidence that training on microaggressions is valuable for improving the well-being of people from historically marginalized or disadvantaged groups, there is reason to believe it could actually be counterproductive to that end. Yeah, I was like, well, I don't want to go into that necessarily, but, let's see, what's the last one? Mandatory, yeah. Mandatory training causes additional blowback. There's a lot of push and pull as to whether these trainings should be mandatory in different institutions. And it's interesting because, they generally bring up negative side effects. They tend to work better, is what he meant, or be less harmful when they're opt-in. Let them be voluntary. Let them be utterly voluntary. They don't need to be, don't have them be mandatory, because he makes a good point, because mandatory trainings, when you're forced to go do something, and I've seen this time and time again with other people who are doing trainings, it's like I used to work with some defense guys and military guys over in North Carolina, and they talked about at one point, it's like, we're just doing this because it came from the Fed, from up above us in leadership, and we don't really want to. Happens all the time. You go in with the wrong mindset if things are mandatory, and there's the science there to back it up. That's what I wanted to make the point on here, is this the reason I'm reading this article in particular with respect to what the science says about diversity trainings. It should be, mandatory. It doesn't seem to be working, although 80% of diversity related training programs in the US seem to be mandatory, which isn't great, because, mandatory trainings often lead to more negative feelings and behaviors. You don't want to be there. If you're forcing it on people who don't want to be there, it's not going to necessarily make anything better. So one of the things we'd say with that front is, he suggested here, and I would actually very much agree with this, it should be a resource. You should encourage people to volunteer for the training. It should have purpose linked to specific organizational and development goals. You could offer small incentives too, but I agree, it should be voluntary, and you should be encouraged to go to it. A good diversity training, hopefully not one that's crazy us versus them mentality, because I think that's a pretty piss poor idea. I agree with our Garby here. It is a very piss poor idea, and science backs it up that it's a bad idea. Not science backs it up. Studies say it is a bad idea. Science itself does not. Studies do. Studies done under the scientific method do. Studies. Thank you. I'm getting annoyed with myself today because I keep slipping into some of those things. Let's see. Yep. So, and again, more studies comes at the expense of other priorities. And this is very true. Budgets are tight right now. And the thing is, the diversity training programs can be really expensive. Half-day diversity trainings won't necessarily change much, and yet they're really expensive. In a world where these training programs consistently advance diversity and inclusion goals within an organization, or enhanced intergroup cooperation and overall productivity, then the cost could be justified even during a time of belt tightening. However, it's a different dynamic when the training is typically ineffective or even counterproductive. Worse, it often crowds out more substantial efforts that could be undertaken to actually enhance diversity and inclusion within institutions. Why do many rely on diversity training despite the demonstrated ineffectiveness? Well, this isn't really super scientific here, though he offers a good reason. Let's see. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Again, I'm going to link this. It's a really, really good article. I really, really encourage you to go read it. And you know what? Shoot me some resources. What do you think? I've answered my question of the day here of what I think. What science suggests, or what multiple studies suggest with regard to the question of whether or not diversity training is actually effective. And I'm going to do more of these just sort of topic things about questions that scientists are asking. And this is a fair question to ask. We're doing a lot of diversity trainings right now, and it bears in mind, are they actually effective? And a substantial portion of research, as Mr. Al-Garbi has put together in this particular thing, is actually really, really ineffective and at times very counterproductive. And you know, there's I forget who said it, but there's a quote that it's the definition of insanity to try the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome. And I feel like that's where we're going with some of the diversity trainings right now. That said, not all of them. Counterweight actually has a great list of diversity trainings that don't do a lot of the things that are described in here. One of them, I think, is Theory of Enchantment. At some point, I'm actually going to try it myself. I haven't decided when. It might be a great over the summer kind of thing to do. But yeah, what do you think about the question of whether or not diversity trainings, as they currently are effective or ineffective? And realize that we're not talking about all diversity trainings in here. He's said himself and caveated it many times. Often, many things do. Not all diversity trainings are like this. And I've said myself, I've been through one that didn't do one of the crazy things that I think is really bad about a lot of diversity trainings and making them us versus them. Yeah, you don't help if you do that. Anyway, I think that's it for me. Let me know what you think. Comment, share, subscribe, like, all that jazz. I kind of went in a weird order with that, but if you like this content, please share it. Please comment. Tell me your thoughts. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts if you have other sources with regard to this particular question that multiple scientists are asking right now. This is the question. Is diversity training effective? So I'd like to actually hear more on this topic from all of you. I am open to having my mind changed. That maybe I'm wrong. Always am. But I want to see the resources you have and take a look for myself. So anyway, I think that's it for right now. I'll be back with more again soon. Let me know what you'd like to see, of course. And of course, oh yeah, before I forget, we uploaded our most recent Sci-Worthy conversation into the Sci-Worthy Locals page. But remember, you can only see that if you are a member of Sci-Worthy on Locals. Sciworthy.locals.com, Sciworthy.locals.com. That will be linked in the description. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Until next time, I'm Adrienne signing off. Stay curious, my friends.